Dry. Thanks? Dear Tim and Moby, how did Thanksgiving begin? From Carrie and Tibby. Well, you've probably heard the story of a group of settlers called the Pilgrims. How in 1620 they came to America in a ship called the Mayflower. How they made friends with the native people and had them over for a feast. And they called it Thanksgiving, and we've been celebrating it ever since. Only problem is, a lot of that stuff is slightly inaccurate. They weren't called pilgrims, and they didn't dress that way. They wouldn't have called the meal Thanksgiving either. For the settlers, Thanksgiving meant a religious day of fasting and prayer. This was more like a harvest festival. As for their relationship with the Wampanoag, well, friends is kind of pushing it. The Wampanoag are a Native American people. Back then, they controlled a chunk of what's now Massachusetts and Rhode Island. They've been living there for thousands of years in dozens of different villages. And they'd been trading with European visitors for over a century. They'd never allowed any permanent settlement on their land, though. Then, in 1616, a disease brought by European traders swept the region. In just a few years, 2/3 of the Wampanoag died. Usamequin, their leader, was worried about invasion. The Narragansett, a rival nation nearby, had been untouched by the disease. So, when the Mayflower landed on his doorstep, he saw an opportunity. The folks on the Mayflower were English. Back home, they belonged to the Church of England, the official state religion. But they believed the church had strayed from true Christianity. When it became clear they couldn't change the church, they started their own separate faith. These separatists left for Holland, where they were free to practice their beliefs. Eventually, they set sail for North America to build a society based around their version of Christianity. When they finally arrived, it was November, and winter was in the air. About 100 people stepped on shore, weak and sick from a difficult journey. They were totally unprepared for the harsh weather and the challenges of their new life. Low on food, they stole from Wampanoag stockpiles, and they robbed graves, taking jewelry and other valuables. By midwinter, people were dying every day of starvation and illness. Like the Wampanoag, the settlers feared their weakness would invite attack. So they took drastic steps to hide it. They dragged the sick from their beds, propping them against trees with guns in their hands. And they buried their dead at night. Only half of them survived the winter. One day that March, a native man walked into the settlers' camp. This was Samoset, a leader from Maine who was staying with the Wampanoag. To the settlers' astonishment, he said, "Welcome, Englishmen." He'd been sent by the Wampanoag to arrange a meeting with the newcomers. A few days later, Usamequin stopped by, along with a little security. Both groups were suspicious of the other. They exchanged hostages so that neither side would pull any tricks. Only then did John Carver, the governor of Plymouth, sit down with Usamequin. He called Usamequin by his title, Massasoit, which means great leader. They shared a ceremonial drink and agreed to terms. They would always meet in peace, and they would defend each other from attack. The treaty saved Plymouth. Usamequin sent an English-speaking man named Tisquantum to stay with the settlers. The English called him Squanto, and he taught them how to survive. He showed them how to plant crops that would thrive, and how to use fish as fertilizer. Tisquantum had actually grown up right there. Before the town became Plymouth, the Wampanoag called it Pawtuxet. It was one of the villages that had been wiped out by disease. The separatists chose the dead village as the site of their settlement. The hard work of clearing the land had already been done by Tisquantum's people. And thanks to his help, Plymouth had a bountiful harvest to celebrate in the fall of 1621. Well, the settlers didn't send out formal invitations. The Wampanoag heard gunfire coming from Plymouth. Were the settlers attacking or being attacked? Usamequin brought 90 men to find out. They found that the settlers were shooting off guns to celebrate the harvest. Usamequin decided they would join the feast and maybe keep an eye on things, although there wasn't quite enough food for 90 unexpected guests. So the Wampanoag went out hunting and brought back some deer. The eating, drinking, and celebrating went on for 3 days, and the alliance between the two groups would last almost half a century. Right, so how come we're celebrating this meal 4 centuries later? Well, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln established Thanksgiving as a national holiday. He thought it might help unite the nation during the Civil War. Most of the Thanksgiving traditions we have today came from that time. Turkey and pumpkin pie were popular in New England in 1863, not 1621. And those buckled hats? 19th century artists made them up. They thought it made the so-called Pilgrims look old-timey, and the tale of their struggle made a perfect national myth, an inspiring story about a country's values and history. The settlers were cast as the first Americans, boldly taming a wilderness, even in the midst of great hardship, taking time to give thanks for what they had. No, bravery and gratitude are awesome qualities that we should all try to live up to. That's kind of the purpose of national myths, to provide examples of our best selves. But myths oversimplify complex stories. We know that Massachusetts was not a wilderness. It was home to a civilization that went back thousands of years. And Plymouth's founding was a dark turning point for those people. They were pushed off their land and had to adapt to a different way of life to survive. That pattern was repeated across the continent for the next 200 years, which is why some Native Americans consider Thanksgiving a day of mourning. For those of us who do celebrate, we can honor that perspective. Taking time to consider it wouldn't be a bad addition to your list of Thanksgiving traditions, even if it's a little heavier than watching football, hanging out with friends, and... Oh no, don't do that.